An assassination in the heart of Iran is having ripple effects around the world.
We woke up to news that an extraordinary event had happened in the region, an assassination in the center of Tehran. It turned out to be Hamas's number one political leader outside of Gaza, Ismail Haniyeh.
That is Steve Hendricks, the Jerusalem bureau chief for The Post. Hamas and Iran immediately blamed Israel for the killing. So far, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the country dealt, quote, crushing blows to Hamas, but he stopped short of claiming responsibility. The details of Haniyeh's death are still unclear. But if you thought that things were already tense in the Middle East, this shocking attack in the capital of Iran could make the situation a lot worse.
To be honest, it's kind of hard to shock me these days because almost every week brings such a huge political or military upheaval. But I was quite stunned that an operation like this, whatever it was, could happen in the center of Tehran. It's an amazing feat of intelligence and some kind of military mission. And it also is a terrifying development here where the region is already on pins and needles, just trying to avoid a wider regional war. We've already got Israel fighting Hamas in Gaza. We've got Hezbollah trading attacks across the border in Lebanon. And now a major attack inside of Iran certainly holds prospects to put a match to the whole situation.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Wednesday, July 31st. Today, we're sitting down with Steve to understand how this assassination of Hamas's top political leader is adding to fears of a wider war in the Middle East, and what it would take to prevent that. So, Steve, tell me a little bit more about this Hamas official who was killed, Ismail Haniyeh. Who was he and why was he important?
He's considered the outright leader of Hamas, and he has been for a number of years, although he was long ago exiled from Gaza. So he's been spending most of his time in Doha, in Qatar. He traveled frequently in the region. He's frequently in Istanbul and Cairo. And he has been involved in the ongoing talks to reach a ceasefire deal and a hostage release agreement with Hamas in Gaza. Although you do hear some resentment among Gazans, for example, who, are very aware that while they are suffering bombardment inside of Gaza, he lives a fairly comfortable lifestyle in Doha and travels around Arab capitals. He is considered quite an impassioned defender of the Palestinian people. Here's what he had to say in an interview to Al Jazeera a couple of years ago.
هذه فلسطين التي على جنباتها وفي أروقتها سالت.
He said, "This is Palestine. Its peripheries and corridors are soaked with the blood of martyrs, the great ones, heroes, and imprisoned men and women."
لذلك نعم نحن نستشعر ثقل الأمانة والمسؤولية.
Lately, his leadership of Hamas has been in question. Effectively, Hamas is two wings. There's the organization overall, and Haniyeh is the head of it, the political wing. And then there's the military wing, Hamas's army, which Sinwar in Gaza commands. Sinwar, who was the mastermind of the October 7th attacks in Israel, and who has been the driving force, seemingly, in the management of the war and also Hamas's willingness to entertain ceasefire proposals, he's really been seen as the dominant figure. They are rivals. I'm not quite sure what this killing will mean for the hierarchy in Hamas, but whatever his current influence, Haniyeh was considered a Hamas leader and certainly very high on Israel's target list.
And do we know if he had a role in planning the October 7th attacks and if that was part of why he was, as you said, high on this list of targets for Israel?
Well, there's a lot of reasons he's high on the list for Israel, predating October 7th. There's a lot we don't know about who knew what and when regarding those surprise attacks. It seems that Iran, who was the sponsor of Hamas and also Hezbollah, did not know, although that's yet to be confirmed, whether or not it was a strictly, closely held arrangement in Sinwar's tunnels under Gaza, or that his titular leader was aware and participating is yet to be determined.
So we know that the reason why this Hamas leader was in Iran was for the inauguration of Iran's new president. And I want to take a moment to explain here the historic ties between Hamas and Iran, and the fact that Hamas as an organization has a very close relationship with the country of Iran. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, very close. In fact, Iran is sort of the sponsor of Hamas. Iran maintains a number of militant groups around the Middle East, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and Hamas in Gaza, and to some degree in the West Bank. They provide funding, arms, direction. This is a network of the Axis, as it's frequently referred to here, that Iran's sort of been using to encircle the region in recent years. They're growing more sophisticated, better armed, better funded. So, countries like Israel, the Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, they, along with the United States, view this operation, this growing influence of Iran to sort of achieve regional hegemony, they would say, is one of the key threats to stability in the region. It's driving a lot of the insecurity here, along with the decades-long Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it's brought, once again, the region to the edge of possible wide conflagration. And it's a major concern of the Israeli government and the Biden administration. And this looks like it could be another crisis point in that campaign.
I want to talk a little bit about the last few days. And if I'm being honest, it feels hard to say that this has been a tense few days, because it really feels like the last 10 months have been a tense time in the Middle East. But in particular, in this past week, we've seen a few different events that seem to have escalated to this point of this strike on Haniyeh. Can you just talk through some of the stuff that we've seen over the last couple of days?
Well, remarkably, the killing of Haniyeh in Tehran was just about 6 hours after another military strike in the suburbs of Beirut killed a very senior Hezbollah commander, Fouad Shukr.
An Israeli airstrike rocked a neighborhood near Beirut. Lebanon's health ministry says at least one person was killed and dozens were injured. The IDF says the strike took out a top Hezbollah leader, Fouad Shukr.
That one Israel acknowledges was a strike in retaliation for an attack that hit a Druze village in the occupied Golan Heights.
Israel is vowing to retaliate after a deadly rocket attack killed 12 children and injured dozens in the Golan Heights area Saturday. Both Israel and the U.S. are blaming Lebanon's militant group Hezbollah for the strike. Hezbollah has denied responsibility.
This, of course, was just the latest in what's been a 9-month-long sort of tit-for-tat exchange of rockets and drones across the Lebanese border. One of the two fronts that Israel is sort of fighting at the moment, in addition to Gaza.
The exchange of fire is continuing to escalate on the Israeli-Lebanon border. In the latest incident, Israel launched an overnight attack deep inside Lebanon. At least one civilian is being killed and 6 others injured in Baalbek. That's 100 kilometers from Israel's border. The same area was attacked last month.
So we were all waiting for a reprisal attack from Israel for that. Israel was under great pressure from Washington and other diplomats to restrain itself, again, to keep this thing from getting too out of control. They struck and killed the individual, Fouad Shukr. It was considered by analysts to be sort of a restrained option that they chose. And there was a bit of relief for a few hours that maybe, the brink of war had been averted once again. And then, of course, we woke up to the news that this remarkable killing had happened inside Iran.
And I want to be clear here that we are talking with you on Wednesday morning, so more details might come out as the day continues. But I'm wondering, what do we know about exactly how this attack was carried out, how Haniya was killed?
Almost nothing at this point. I mean, by the time listeners hear this, there may be more clarity, but in the first hours afterwards, there were conflicting reports. The Iranian government did not release anything specific, including video or photographs. There were some reports that suggested it was some kind of raid, implying a hit squad or agents on the ground. That actually sounds quite surprising, but it has precedent. There was an Iranian nuclear scientist who was gunned down just outside of Tehran in 2020, showing that Israel does have the capability of operating in Iranian territory. The other reports are more likely, and a couple of state media suggested it was some kind of missile fired from outside of Iranian territory. Either case represents a tremendous failure on the behalf of Iran to basically protect its guests. So it was, whether it was meant or not, it clearly sends a signal to the militants there that they aren't necessarily safe.
And we have seen reactions from Iranian officials, from Hamas officials. The Iranian Ayatollah said that it was Iran's duty to avenge the killing. And we heard similar language coming from Hamas. What do you make of that? Like, what does that tell you about what this could look like?
Well, for one thing, it's perfectly understandable. It's the rhetoric that follows all incidents like this, but it's also very likely true. They will feel tremendous pressure to respond. This is, it is a humiliating attack to take place in the Iranian capital. So there will be a response, almost certainly. Now I think we enter the phase where diplomats will try to minimize that response. It's a bit of a dance that we've seen many times in recent months and more times over recent years. What would be a return strike that would save face and allow the Iranian commanders to say, we have delivered a blow back, but would not, in turn force Israel to respond again and give us the cycle of escalation that would possibly result in all-out war. In these first hours, there's nothing but speculation about that, but we do know from American officials that diplomatic efforts are certainly underway. Haniya's funeral is, at this point, I believe, scheduled for Friday, and if it follows patterns from previous incidents, nothing should be expected before that. So we have a couple of days where it's just going to be a lot of anxiety and efforts, for diplomats to do what they can.
After the break, Steve weighs in on why Iran might still be hesitant to retaliate and what could lead to an all-out war. We'll be right back. Steve, you were talking about some of the international reaction to this. And to be clear, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, they've come out and said, look, this is something that we were not aware of or involved in. And there are, as you said, obviously serious concerns around the world that this is going to lead to further escalation and destruction in this war. But more immediately, this was a moment where there was some amount of optimism about the prospect of a ceasefire finally between Israel and Hamas and these talks that have been taking place in Rome. What does this do to that potential for a ceasefire?
Well, it certainly can't help it. Haniya was considered, he certainly was a participant in the talks. He's Hamas's top leader who's able to travel to those places. Even if he is not the final word on what Hamas will decide, his absence will have to be repaired. So there'll certainly, I understand, be some sort of immediate delay, which will be crushing news to Gazan civilians who are, just enduring unimaginable humanitarian conditions. The families of Israeli hostages are desperate and furious for a deal that would, release their loved ones. It really is just a crushing disappointment following several other rounds of talks that have seemed promising and then collapsed. And you're right. U.S. officials have been saying that these are probably their best chance in months, if not ever, to get a meaningful deal. We don't know. We haven't heard from Rome. There's certainly been no official cessation of talks. But the expectation is that this is a blow to them that will have to be recovered from. And it follows a week in which Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was in Washington and really heard from all sides, from President Biden to Donald Trump to lawmakers, the families, American families of Israeli hostages, just kind of beseeching him at all stops to reach a deal. Contrary to the signals he's been giving that he may prefer to delay, this may serve his interest in some accounts because it helps him politically. Certainly is under pressure from his right wing not to make a deal. But also, he's recently added some late addition conditions for a deal. So he's accused of already acting as if he wanted to slow these or bring them to a halt. And now certainly some cynics will say the timing of this contributes to that.
Interesting. Yeah, like thinking about how this could affect Netanyahu's leadership and power going forward. I also wonder about what this means for Hamas going forward. If this was a major leader, and I know that you said that there has been this rift within Hamas between Haniya and Sinwar of late, like the fact that Haniya is now out of the picture. I mean, does that make Hamas weaker? Does that make Hamas stronger if there's now the one guy who's clearly in charge?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would describe it as a rift, but they have been rivals, and Sinwar has effectively been usurping the power of Haniya. And this can only contribute to that, I would say. I mean, he's gone, and he is a power center in the organization. Sinwar is, well, on the one hand, he's ascendant within Hamas, but he's also trapped and hunted. His freedom of movement is obviously very limited. He's assumed to be in a subterranean space under Gaza. And he is absolutely Israel's target number one. And I don't think the future of Hamas is really ready to be written and even begun until there's a resolution to the Gaza war, which will include some provisions for Hamas to move around again in Gaza or not. I mean, that's one of the key sticking points. Netanyahu is determined to keep the boot on the neck of Hamas, keep them from resurgence. But his commanders are telling him that's really quite an impossible goal, that this is an ideological group that will survive in some form. And Israel will be looking at basically years of trying to keep it from becoming a powerful enough enemy to repeat October 7th. But at this point, you'd have to say that Sinwar is the one position to take it forward.
Steve, you talked about what some of those fears are, that this most recent attack could help balloon this conflict even more, turn it into a full-blown war, not only between Israel and Hamas, but a war with Iran, a war with Lebanon, like a war that pulls in a lot of other entities in the Middle East. And I think it's frankly not hard for a lot of us to imagine how that could play out. But I want to talk about another scenario in which this most recent attack does not have that escalating effect. Can you talk about the off-ramp here, or what's the argument to make that this will not result in more back and forth attacks and that it may not mean the worst case scenario?
Well, the worst case is not guaranteed by any means. There are constraints at play, and the motivations for going big, as it were, they shift. And although all parties may, dream of the day when there's a conclusive all-out fight, when it happens is really important in strategic thinking for them. So there is a bit of a consensus that none of the parties are looking for this major war. Of course, there was a consensus that Hamas was not looking for the ultimate confrontation with Israel before October 7th, and that was wrong. So I think analysts are a little humbled about all this right now. But there is a sense among experts that Tehran does not want to go all the way with Israel at a moment when it's got its largest army in decades, an army that's kind of very tired but also very honed with its fighting in Gaza, with the United States not just pledging to be by Israel's side in case of an attack from Iran, but having done just that in April. So Iran would face quite a fearsome enemy, united enemy, if it really wanted to launch a large-scale attack. We know they're aware of that. There also might be very significant economic restraints. I talked to an Iran expert today who said effectively their treasury has about 3 days' worth of public employee salaries at hand in local currency. Their economy is racked by sanctions, lingering effects from the COVID pandemic. They're not in top form, and even a small war with Israel could, exacerbate the obvious restive tensions with their own population. On the other side as well, Israel, there are definitely camps, even very influential camps inside of Israel that I don't think people are saying let's go to war with Iran, but many are saying let's go to war with Hezbollah, which would be sort of regional war light, a cross-border war like ones they have fought before could be very damaging. So it's just a very murky outlook right now, but it is very volatile, and events like the killing of Hania in Tehran do feel like a match to the powder keg.
Steve, thank you so much for sharing your reporting.
Thanks, Martine.
Steve Hendricks is the Jerusalem bureau chief for The Post. Before we go, here's some other news we've been watching. The future of Project 2025 is now uncertain. So you may have heard a little bit about Project 2025. We've talked about it on the show. It's been in the news. It's this comprehensive conservative plan to transform the federal government if Donald Trump gets elected again. And it comes from the think tank, the Heritage Foundation. They wanted to get rid of the Department of Education, roll back environmental regulations, and close the southern border. But this plan has received a lot of blowback, both from Democrats and from Republicans who wanted to distance themselves, including Trump himself. On Tuesday, the head of that project at the Heritage Foundation stepped down, and the organization said that it's winding down its policy efforts, throwing the future of Project 2025 into question. Also, this afternoon, Trump made an appearance at the National Association of Black Journalists convention in Chicago. In an interview with journalists on stage, Trump said that he didn't know that Vice President Kamala Harris was black, quote, until a number of years ago when she happened to turn it black.
And she was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
She is always identified as a black woman. She went to a historically black college.
I respect either one, but she obviously doesn't, because she was Indian all the way, and then all of a sudden she made a turn and she became a black person.
Just to be clear, sir, do you believe
That is Rachel Scott of ABC News pushing back. Harris, of course, has embraced her black identity in many ways. She went to Howard University. She was part of a historically black sorority. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre called Trump's comments repulsive and insulting. In recent months, the Trump campaign has been making explicit overtures to Black Americans. Some polling suggests that Trump is faring better with black voters now than he did in 2020. But Trump has also raised some eyebrows with how he talks about black people. At last month's debate, he talked about his commitment to protecting, quote-unquote, black jobs, a comment that got brought up again in today's combative back and forth at NABJ.
But one of the big problems, and a lot of the journalists in this room I know and I have great respect for, a lot of the journalists in this room are black. I will tell you that coming from the border are millions and millions of people that happen to be taking black jobs. You had the best.
What exactly is a black job, sir?
A black job is anybody that has a job. That's what it is. Anybody that has a job.
All right.
And
Mr. President,
they're taking the employment away from black people. They're coming in, and they're coming in, they're invading. It's an invasion of millions of people, probably 15, 16, 17 million people.
That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you want to show your support for the show, please subscribe to The Washington Post. Not only is it a great way to help us continue to do this work, but you can now get access to Washington Post podcasts ad-free in Apple Podcasts. Subscribe in Apple Podcasts or by following the link in our show notes. Today's show was produced by Emma Talkoff with help from Sabby Robinson and Ali Bianco. It was edited by Rena Flores with help from Monica Campbell. It was mixed by Sean Carter. Thanks also to Jen Amer and Aaron Cunningham. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from The Washington Post.